You've probably come across some version of a video like this that says, eat more Brazil nuts or walnuts, add some zinc, and your testosterone levels will climb on their own. There's a grain of truth in there. Food really does set the stage when it comes to creating hormones. But if you've run that list and your levels still have not moved in a meaningful way, let's have some real talk about food and testosterone. I'm Dr. Kenny, an IFM certified functional medicine practitioner. And today we're going to talk about why many food first approaches fall short, because before any food can actually act to raise your testosterone, or insert action here, it has to clear three gates. And which one is stuck is the whole story about whether or not these food first approaches may work for you or not. And I want to be upfront about something before we get into the list, because I think this framing matters. When it comes to food first approaches, whether we're talking about testosterone or gut health, or the list goes on, it's important to know that food first is on the far side of the spectrum when it comes to the concentration of the active ingredients and the potency of how therapeutic they can be. I always tell my patients food is on this far end of the spectrum. Supplements are often somewhere in the middle, and then of course drugs or surgery are on the far end of the spectrum. The zinc in a handful of pumpkin seeds, for instance, is real zinc, but extracting it in the right form and the right concentrations to have a therapeutic effect on the body is a different story. And so it's important to note that if you're using food first approaches to affect lab values, that we take extra consideration to dosing, timing, correct forms in order to have an actual therapeutic function. So what I want to do today is use foods to ground us in something real. And then we're going to talk about the mechanisms underneath them, how nutrition works to support testosterone production and levels, because the mechanism is what tells you whether the food is even relevant to your situation or not. When you understand your individual mechanism or mechanisms, you stop guessing when it comes to using nutrition and nutrients to help support your health and healing. We mentioned three gates when it comes to testosterone production. So let me give you a map before we talk through the foods themselves, because this is the frame that makes everything else make sense when you can really ground in this. Think of testosterone production like a manufacturing process, and the same goes for many of our hormones and other substances in the body. And it depends on three completely separate things being in order, all three, before the final product shows up in a usable form in your tissues. Gate one is supply. Your body needs the raw materials to manufacture testosterone in the first place, specifically cholesterol and specific micronutrients that act as catalysts, or the chemical helpers that allow the conversion reactions to take place. If those raw materials are missing or being redirected elsewhere, production of testosterone suffers at the source. Gate number two is signal. Even with enough supply from the supply chain side, your Leydig cells, these are cells in the testes that actually produce testosterone, need a relatively quiet environment to do their job. Leydig cells are the factory workers, if you will, in this analogy. Chronic inflammation, whether it's coming from your gut, your diet, or virtually any source, whether hidden or perceived, acts like static on the line between the brain and the Leydig cells. And when the signal is noisy, output drops, even when the materials are available. Gate number three is release and availability of testosterone. Once testosterone is produced, a significant portion of it gets bound to a carrier protein in the blood called sex hormone binding globulin, or SHBG. Bound testosterone is essentially locked away. Your tissues cannot use it. Only the free fraction does anything useful in the body. Gate number three is the regulatory layer that determines how much of what your body has made actually reaches your receptors where they have their action. The honest clinical truth that I see is that most food and testosterone conversations address gate one and stops there. It gives you a supply story more than anything else. But if gate two or gate three is where your actual traffic jam is, no amount of zinc or selenium is going to move your levels because those inputs are entering a system with constraints that supplies cannot override. So with that map in hand, let's go through the list here. We're going to talk about 4 foods that support testosterone production, and more importantly, why? What are the mechanisms that make this happen? Brazil nuts are one form that shows up in nearly every video on this topic, and for real reason. The selenium, which Brazil nuts are famous for, are actually in meaningful amounts. In fact, only 1 or 2 go a long way, and you really don't want more than that. Selenium functions as a cofactor in the step-by-step conversion chain that turns cholesterol into testosterone. Cofactor means, again, that it's the chemical helper in this conversion process, and the entire reaction cannot run without it. It enables the reaction rather than just performing it or being a nice to have. So that's really important to understand. The mechanism is at gate 1 when it comes to selenium. It's the raw material requirement for the conversion chemistry. Here's the caveat though. 2 Brazil nuts per day is a reasonable ceiling. So keep that in mind. Selenium toxicity is real. And it is easy to overshoot with a food source that is concentrated like Brazil nuts, especially if you're coupling it with another supplement. More is not more here, and with many nutrients. This is one of the cases where a food-first approach has a built-in upper limit that many videos also glide past, so be very aware of that. So for multiple reasons, if you're eating a handful of Brazil nuts every day and wondering why your testosterone has moved less than expected, this is definitely worth knowing. Selenium matters when there is a deficiency. When your levels are already adequate, adding more does not continue to push production upwards. There's a certain rate limiting step when it comes to these chemical reactions. So you're working on a problem that may have already been solved or wasn't really there in the first place. Food category number 2 is fatty fish and an omega-3 signal, more specifically. Fatty fish like salmon, sardines, mackerel. These are on the list specifically because of the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio in your diet, and what that ratio does to the Leydig cell environment that we talked about previously. Here's the picture that I want you to hold. Your Leydig cells sit in an environment that is constantly receiving chemical signals from the rest of the body. Think of it as background noise here, ultimately. When your omega-6 intake, which is the more inflammatory form of fats, very common in the standard American diet, is chronically high relative to your omega-3s, which is the default, again, in most Western diets, the inflammatory signaling that results acts like static in the transmission between your brain and these Leydig cells. The brain sends the signal to produce testosterone. It comes from higher up, and the cells are working in a noisy, inefficient, suppressive environment, so they cannot respond at full capacity. Fatty fish help to shift that ratio in a big way. That is gate 2 work, if we're talking about the gates we were exploring earlier. It's about reducing the suppressive signal that is interfering with production in the first place. This is also where I want to be honest about timing. Even when the inflammatory environment improves, Leydig cell output can lag behind by some time. That gap between reducing inflammatory burden and recovered production is real, and how long it lasts tells you something about whether or not the suppression has been running for months or years. In many men that I treat, this inflammatory pattern has been going on for some time, even decades. So cleaning up the fat ratio is the right move. It just tends to show up on a lab report later than people expect, oftentimes when it's a little bit more complex than just inflammation versus less inflammation. A systematic review on environmental hormone disruptors found something worth sitting with here too. A higher exposure to BPA, which is a main ingredient in the plastics that many of us are exposed to, was A, negatively correlated with sex hormone binding globulin, and B, positively correlated with markers of chronic low-grade inflammation, insulin resistance, and fatty liver, all in the same cluster. That is a picture of how environmental and inflammatory load can simultaneously suppress the binding protein that determines whether or not your testosterone is free to act on the cells or not. And this is exactly why cleaning up diet alone without addressing the broader terrain like environment can feel like moving one variable in a system that has many more at play. Food category number 3 is leafy greens, and specifically the magnesium thread. Spinach, kale, Swiss chard, these are on the testosterone support list primarily because of the magnesium. You can throw almonds and other high magnesium foods here too, which is one of the most commonly deficient nutrients in the standard American diet and contemporary life in general. And the mechanism is a gate 3 story here. Remember gate 3, the sex hormone binding globulin binding, that carrier protein that determines how much testosterone stays locked away versus circulating freely to act. Magnesium influences those binding dynamics. You can almost think of the receptors in your cells as bathing in magnesium. At adequate magnesium status, the proportion of testosterone that is held onto that carrier shifts slightly toward a more free and usable fraction. The total amount in your body, however, stays the same. It's just what becomes active versus inactive. One of the biggest problems I see too assessing magnesium status is that many people look at a CBC, which is a routine blood panel, and they see magnesium on there that's usually within normal limits, and they think, okay, my magnesium status is great. However, the true picture of functional magnesium status is a specific marker called red blood cell magnesium. That's the one you should be looking for. Our body will prefer and normalize the plasma levels versus the red blood cell levels, which is a better measure for functional magnesium status. And it's important too to realize here that sex hormone binding globulin is influenced by so many variables aside from magnesium. It's one thing that we talk about, but I don't ever want to risk getting too oversimplified, which many of these food first conversations often do. Magnesium is one input that influences it. Insulin resistance and blood sugar balance is another, even if you haven't flagged the abnormal prediabetes or diabetes insulin resistance values. Zinc status is another one that influences this, as well as liver function. So magnesium matters and deficiency is common, so it's important to address, but it can only be part of the picture. If sex hormone binding globulin is elevated because of insulin resistance or liver stress, adding magnesium through leafy greens will accomplish a lot less than you might hope. Next, let's anchor around another nut, walnuts. These are another useful example of a gate 1 support because they bring together several of the raw materials that you need at once: zinc, omega-3 fatty acids, and healthy fats that support cholesterol availability as a hormone precursor, or the earlier products. Walnuts are a useful example of gate 1 support, again, because they support several of the raw material inputs at once: zinc, omega-3s, and healthy fats that support cholesterol availability as the main supply for hormone creation. Your body manufactures testosterone from cholesterol. It also makes the other sex hormones as well as cortisol from cholesterol. Your liver produces most of what it needs inside yourself, but dietary fat and fat-soluble nutrient status set the environment for that chemistry further upstream. So when the supply is genuinely limited, adding foods that support it make a difference. The patients who tend to see the most movement from this supply-based work in their diet are those who are actually running low, men who have been eating very low-fat diets, for instance, or highly processed diets for a long time, or maybe even those on statin medications, which lower cholesterol. Men under caloric restriction and fasting, or those whose zinc status is also genuinely depleted. These are all areas that walnuts are doing real work, potentially. So the biggest takeaway here is that you have to know which gate is your gate before you know which food is the lever that you might strategically lean on for a food-first approach to supporting testosterone. Now, a couple foods that work against the system. Peanuts show up in the caution column here, and the standard explanation is the fact that they are often exposed to mold and its related toxins like aflatoxin, particularly in lower quality or those that are poorly stored. That explanation is a real starting point when it comes to removing peanuts as a potential source of inflammation that is hidden. But I want to take it one level deeper as well, because the more important story for many people is what aflatoxin and its related stressors on the liver do to the hormonal environment over time. Your liver is a regulatory layer in the testosterone picture. Sex hormone binding globulin is manufactured and regulated in the liver. Insulin signaling, fatty liver, and anything that increases the liver's processing burden all influence how much sex hormone binding globulin the liver can produce, and therefore how much testosterone stays locked away. So when you're regularly introducing compounds that add stress to the liver, like alcohol or fructose or other sources, the downstream effect includes a shift in the hormone binding environment, often before any standard liver function tests will flag any findings as abnormal. So when dietary changes do not move the needle the way you expected, the question worth asking is whether the liver and the metabolic and processing environment are set up to let testosterone circulate freely in the first place. And by the way, if you'd like to see the research that I compiled together for today's video, I've put together a free research summary that walks through the studies that I used here and what they mean in plain language with some takeaways. So check that out. It's in the pinned comment and the description below. The next caution-based food or nut is cashews, and they land here too for a different reason than peanuts. The issue is that their omega-6 fatty acid profile is a little askew. Cashews are not a harmful food by any measure, but they are relatively high in omega-6s compared to other nuts. And when they become a daily staple or something that you lean on, a handful in the afternoon or cashew butter, they can contribute to that very fat ratio we were talking about earlier. If your baseline is already eating more omega-3s, like the sardines and the walnuts, and also throwing in the magnesium with the leafy greens, occasional cashews are fine. If cashews are replacing, however, the omega-3 foods on your plate, they might be working against your testosterone signals. And I want to zoom out again for a moment because this is where much of the real teaching lives here. The patients who I see who have done the list of foods to support testosterone and whose levels have barely moved almost always share a pattern underneath the surface. The dietary inputs are not really the issue that we're talking about here. We get so wrapped up in food conversations in our very diet-focused culture. One common pattern is what's called the cortisol steal. Your body manufactures both cortisol and testosterone from the same supply chain ultimately, and more specifically a precursor called pregnenolone. Think of pregnenolone as a shared raw material, essentially, that can be routed in either direction. When you're under chronic stress load, whether it's physical or emotional or inflammatory or environmental or work or family, whatever it is, the body prioritizes cortisol because survival takes precedence over reproduction, very simply put. Testosterone is, in a very real sense in this way, a finesse function of the body. It's what the body invests in when things are stable, and the first thing it pulls resources away from when it is managing a threat. So if the stress load is high and sustained, the supply gets redirected upstream before it even reaches testosterone production. Another common pattern is early insulin resistance, even before it shows up on labs. We talked about its relationship to SHBG, and it locks up more testosterone at gate number 3. And a third layer again is the liver. The liver's ability to process, convert, and calibrate the hormonal environment changes over time when there is chronic inflammation or toxic burden or perhaps genetic predispositions that affect the way someone processes hormones. This is why in practice I use a Dutch test, because it often shows us so much more than just is testosterone or estrogen or whatever the hormone is present, but also how is your body interacting with those hormones? How is it processing them? Are your tissues being exposed to high or low amounts? And beyond. They begin to understand that it's so much more than chasing a total end number. We need to honor the systems and the lifespan of hormones as well. A recent study on zinc and testosterone found a signal too, but it was clearest in men who were genuinely deficient in zinc. It is a pretty common deficiency, so get it checked out. And I'm curious, if you've made some real changes to your diet for testosterone and had an honest conversation with your doctor or practitioner, what happened? What did that conversation look like? I'd love to hear the stories. I read every one of the comments. So as you can see, there's a number of variables involved in the investigation when we look at the gates that determine testosterone production, all the way from supply to the end in processing and binding. If this kind of conversation is resonating with you, and you've done the work or made the real changes and something still feels off or incomplete, and you're in one of the states that I practice in, the next step is to watch a free training that's linked in the description below. It'll walk you through how I approach cases like this and prepare you for a health mystery map call with me. It'll also help give you a clearer picture of whether or not what I do fits where you are in your healing journey. The deeper version of the SHBG question is one that trips up a lot of men and their doctors as well, specifically on what it actually looks like when free testosterone is low and total testosterone reads normal on paper. That is a gate 3 story as well, from the inside out. And it's a piece that connects directly to something a lot of men ask me about. Many of them feel completely drained even when every lab value on their routine blood work is normal. So that is exactly what I go over in this video here. Check it out. I'm Dr. Kenny, Root Cause Health Detective. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.